Sorry about the late start there. Anyway, we'll quickly transition over here now to the meeting. For some reason, the fucking graphics card on my computer wasn't actually putting out any image, so I couldn't see what was going on. So here we go.
It needs to change. We cannot break this cycle with piecemeal responses. Addiction services must be trauma-centred. Frontline staff see the realities every day, yet their insights are too often lost in bureaucracy. We need direct conversations between frontline practitioners and policymakers. And with that in mind, I urge the committee to consider 1. More residential treatment and detox places. Beds must be available when people are ready, not months later. 2. Recovery programmes in prisons and communities. Prisons should be a gateway to change, with detox counselling and education provided and community-based alternative prioritised. And following that, 3. Housing solutions that support sobriety. Safe recovery housing and step-down accommodation are essential. Relapse is almost guaranteed if people leave treatment into homelessness or prison. 4. Training for social workers and frontline staff, skills in trauma and addiction, improve decisions, reduce stigma and strengthen families. This also requires investment in the workforce through training, regulation and recognition of addiction professionals. 5. Quality trauma-informed care. Staff across addiction, mental health and justice must be trained to ask what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. This also means expanding evidence-based therapies already piloted in Ireland, such as seeking safety, coping skills for addiction recovery, trauma-focused CBT and EMDR, eye movement desensitisation and reprocessing. 6. Early intervention for children, school-based supports, counselling and parenting programmes like Parenting Under Pressure reduce the risk of repeating the cycle. And to close, Chair, members, intergenerational trauma does not have to continue. With timely treatment, recovery supports and trauma-informed services shaped by frontline knowledge and the voices of marginalised communities, we can break the cycle. The choice is ours to keep managing crisis or to invest in real recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that powerful contribution. I now invite Dr. James O'Shea to give your opening statement on behalf of Addiction Counsellors of Ireland.
Thank you, Chairman and members of the committee. Addiction Counsellors of Ireland is grateful for this opportunity to contribute to your deliberations on this very important issue of intergenerational trauma. A written submission has been provided to members in advance, and this oral statement will highlight key themes therein. Our members work in a trauma-informed manner on a daily basis, providing therapeutic interventions designed to promote safety, stabilisation and recovery. Our submission identifies 3 key areas for your consideration. Firstly, contributing and contextual factors for intergenerational trauma. Secondly, priorities for reducing its impact. And thirdly, a continuum of proposed psychological interventions to respond to trauma. Firstly, as others have cited, intergenerational trauma tends to emerge within a broader context of family difficulties, community structures and social disadvantage. Poverty, marginalisation, unequal access to resources place additional pressures on both families and communities. Intergenerational trauma is shaped by a range of interacting factors, and it includes some of the following: parental substance use, adverse childhood experiences, family dynamics, and a whole slew of broader community challenges. However, the research is clear, and it demonstrates that appropriate intervention can support families and communities in breaking cycles of harm. Secondly, reducing intergenerational trauma requires a strong policy direction. This means embedding trauma-informed practice across our health, education, social care and our justice systems. It also requires strengthening of protective environments through evidence-based family and youth programmes. And it also involves ensuring that trauma and addiction are treated in a timely manner and treated together. Critically important is investment in early intervention, so that challenges are identified and can be addressed before they escalate. Long-term progress depends on building collaborations across all sectors of our health and social care systems. And this allows for services to operate in a coordinated, consistent and sustainable manner. Thirdly, we propose a continuum of psychological interventions which are essential to effective evidence-based responses. Firstly, universal trauma awareness programmes would ensure that frontline staff across all sectors are trained to understand, to provide safe environments and to respond sensitively to trauma. The next level is early recognition. This might involve staff training to identify signs of trauma, but also to be able to signpost and make appropriate and timely referrals. And this would prevent people from falling through the net. Building upon this foundation, skills programmes such as Seeking Safety and COSAR, which have already been piloted within the HSE and some of our voluntary and community services, provide structured, skills-based supports at low to moderate levels of intensity. For those with more significant trauma problems, as Caroline has mentioned, specialist trauma therapies are required. These might include cognitive therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and as Caroline has also noted, EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And if the members have questions about those specific therapies, I'm happy to speak to them afterwards. International evidence is clear that concurrent treatment of trauma and substance use is more effective than sequential treatment, and long periods of abstinence are not necessary before trauma therapy can begin. So essentially, colleagues, what we're saying is that we should be treating trauma and addiction at the same time, together, in a speedy and timely manner, but that we should not be mandating long periods of abstinence for people to be able to access those services. Finally, for those with the most complex needs, those with severe mental health problems, those with complex PTSD, they require referral to integrated HSE-led dual diagnosis services. At this level, highly trained trauma-focused addiction counsellors, psychotherapists, psychologists, nurses and other professionals would be embedded within the HSE's emerging dual diagnosis teams. In conclusion, Chairman, intergenerational trauma represents a major challenge for our health and social care systems, but this is far from insurmountable. Ireland has the potential to provide a coordinated, trauma-informed and evidence-based response across all of our services. We in Addiction Counsellors of Ireland, as the only body that specifically represents addiction counsellors in Ireland, we are fully committed to working in partnership with colleagues across health, social care, education and justice systems to ensure that families and communities affected by trauma are supported to recover, thrive and indeed prosper. God bless.
Thank you, Dr. O'Shea. Thank you to all our contributors. We'll now move over to members. Members have 7 minutes to ask your questions, make your points. Questions can be referred to an individual or more collectively. I would ask that members leave some time at the end for the questions to be answered. Deputy John Pollisay, you've switched your time with Deputy Burke, if that's okay. Deputy Burke, you're up first. You're up first.
Okay, sorry, didn't realise that. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your contributions here and for the work that you are doing. And it is a difficult challenge in dealing with the work that you're in, and I very much appreciate the contribution that you are making. Can I just touch on in relation to the issue raised about the prison system and the supports within the prison system, where people end up in prison, whether it's male or female, and the supports within the prison systems, from your own information and from dealing with them, what is your own view about how we're dealing with drug addiction, but also the issue of trauma within prisons and also about the medical care within prisons? And I'm just wondering I'm not sure who wants to contribute to that, but it's an issue that I've certainly come across previously. Yep.
I'm happy to address that. So I run addiction and mental health clinics in the Doka Centre, and my colleagues would in Mountjoy and Wheatfield. And I suppose the first thing I'll say, and it's no secret, that the prisons are really overcrowded. There's three in a room, one on a floor. First of all, that's very tight, and it can lead to other complications, or dynamics within, like particularly within the women's prison because it's so small. But in terms of mental health supports that are available, I think the prison probably rely heavily on external services that come in to support the women inside, and similarly with the men, they have core supports for addiction counselling within the prison, but there's only so many staff, and a client might report that they're on a waiting list, or they get to see the counsellor once a month, which isn't adequate. And it's not the service's fault as such, it's just the resources aren't there.
Yeah. But is there not a problem in the prison system? And I've come across a case where someone was providing medical care in a prison rather than people being taken to clinics and hospitals, because the problem about taking to clinics and hospital, you don't have the continuity, whereas if you have someone coming into the prisons providing the care, you have that continuity. I don't know whether people have come across that issue. Yeah.
I suppose the issue is that you shouldn't have to go to prison to get access to the services that you need, because the prison experience in itself is experienced by some people as traumatic, because they can be exposed to violence in custody, they can experience other harms in custody. The majority of people who are going into custody are serving short sentences. So in reality, they're just coming in and going out, and they're not actually getting access to the services. If you're on a long sentence, you have a better chance of eventually, getting through that waiting list. And I know what you say about continuity.
But
and because
just in relation to people going in and out, isn't there a problem then about, even if they do get care inside, is the continuation of that support when they leave the prison system, that there isn't a structure there to make sure that that care that they require is not available once they leave the prison system?
And it is costing money by having them coming in, when if the money was invested in community approaches instead, they would get that continuity of care in the community without then having had that prison experience, which is also, we know that going to prison is bad for your health. People who go to prison have more physical health issues and mental health issues.
And just going back to, dealing with issues and trying to avoid people going down the wrong road and to getting into difficulties. And, there's various projects in, all of the cities in Cork, Limerick, Dublin, trying to support young people. But do you think more could be done about providing support to a lot of the organisations that are providing that care to young people who might have dropped out of the educational system, might have got into minor difficulties with the Gardaí? Do you think a lot more could be done in that whole area as regards also dealing with the issues you're talking about at an earlier stage?
Thanks, Deputy Burke. I suppose one of the things that strikes me is that many of our young people who are going into prison have experienced significant traumatic life experiences themselves. And these life experiences, as Dr. Lambert has pointed to, they're contributing to substance misuse problems, but they're also contributing to a whole range of social problems as well. And the difficulty, I think, and the problem with trauma and traumatic life experiences is that, trauma fuels trauma. So people have traumatic life experiences, they get themselves in bother, they go into prison, they're involved in various activities where they actually experience more trauma. So I think probably what we've become very good at in this country is responding to addiction and responding to it early. Like I've spent most of my adult life working in and around addiction services, and there's a huge improvement in the quality of our addiction services over that time frame. I think we're only early days and our services are only emerging for treating trauma. And I think we need to be recognising that, as Dr. Lambert has said, there's such a high overlap between traumatic life experience and substance misuse. We need to be treating them both early and quickly and efficiently using evidence-based interventions.
Yeah, and I suppose the reason I'm asking that question, I was involved in a project in Cork myself where young people would have dropped out of school, got into difficulties with the Gardaí. We had a project where at any one time we had about 50 people in, where we provided even simple things like literacy and numeracy they were running into difficulties with, and providing support for them, and then eventually getting them out onto the jobs market. In fact, when we did a research about people who had been with us 5 years earlier, over 70% of the group that had been with us 5 years earlier were in full-time employment. So the important thing is about intervention. I'm just wondering, can we replicate that in an awful lot of areas where people are going down the road towards drug use and drug misuse, and can we do a lot more in that whole area?
There was an excellent programme very similar to what you're describing in Mayo some years back called Foundation for Life, and a bit like you said, it was offering kind of skills, education, vocational kind of interventions for young people at a very, very early age, and there was a huge uptake of those young people either going on to further education or going into employment. I think there's a whole slew of those kind of projects in the community and voluntary sector that are highly effective and yes, absolutely, should be resourced and should be supported. Laura, I think you want to...
Yeah, so I'd agree in terms of resourcing the provision of those type of supports, but I think, and they're absolutely necessary, but I think we can, even if we listen to a lot of the points that have been made around trauma and how trauma contributes to addiction and mental health issues, we need to take a few steps back even further and begin to properly invest in those early intervention supports. So early years programmes, working with families where there are children within the household and beginning to support those families and those young people in an effort to even delay or prevent young people, travelling towards those type of services. But when we're thinking about trauma and that impact of trauma on an entire family, we need to look at how do we support and help families together. And I think just another couple of points that have been made, I think in terms of that prison system piece, we need to really think about, are we saying that it's an effective response to deal with trauma and mental health and addiction related issues through a criminal justice response? And unfortunately that's often how we deal with and respond to trauma. It is through a criminal justice response. And there's lots of statutory and voluntary and community services that are available to work with people in an effort that it doesn't have to be dealt with through a criminal justice response.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Deputy. Senator Ryan, you're next.
Thanks very much, Ciara. And thank you everybody for your opening statements. And just as full disclosure to everybody in the committee, I sit on the ACI board, so it's lovely to see you in real life. We don't get many opportunities. My first question is around ACEs. So you've all alluded around, you've all touched on ACEs and the importance of it. And I suppose my question is around that in terms of addiction services when you're screening for ACEs. Sometimes there's a push and kind of pull thing, because like when you're a therapist and you are trying to screen for ACEs, but you're also trying to forge a relationship with the person before you go into these intrusive questions about their past. But then you have to fill out these forms like they do it in the audit because you need to get them into treatment service. So how do we do that ethically and safely? Because I just remember having to do it with a woman, and the story always stuck with me, because a lot of people who are looking at addiction treatment services, they're not even aware of their own trauma. So I had to ask her a question and she's like, I never had any adverse experiences. And then she said, I would sit at the table and I would eat my dinner. And if I didn't want to eat my dinner, my mother would force feed me until I vomited. And to her, that wasn't an ACE, So how do we do it ethically and safely, essentially? Or do we also need to, I suppose, teach the people who are coming into the services what ACEs actually are?
Yes, Dr. Lambert.
Thanks, Senator Ryan. So you've touched on a very important topic, which is the increasing bureaucracy that exists in therapeutic services. So there's pressure often on funders to say you have to complete X number of forms, as evidence that you're doing the work, when the work is the sitting in front of the person. A trauma-sensitive service or trauma-informed service offers a client-driven service, so when is the right time for this person, and it's not dictated by the amount of paperwork that has to be completed to satisfy any one particular agency. There are organisations that are doing trauma screening. They're using the ACE scale. That was not designed as a clinical assessment tool. The Felici et al. In 1998, who actually designed that 10-item scale that you're talking about, that was designed for epidemiological research. It is not a clinical tool, because you're right. It has 10 items on it. It places all of the adversity within the family home. It doesn't consider things like bullying and discrimination, and nor does it tell you, for example, you might tick one ACE on that. but your experience of that one item could have been the same as somebody's experience of 10 traumas. So it's not appropriate and it shouldn't be done. And some kind of national framework would be great. But just on your second point there about should there be some kind of national or some kind of public health campaign in relation to trauma. So we have public health campaigns in relation to lots of different things because we want the public to be safe and to be well. And a lot of, there are ways of delivering public health campaigns in relation to toxic stress that doesn't make people feel stigmatised. Because you have to remember that a lot of trauma that does occur in the family home is because of structural inequality. But it would be really good for people to have access to psychoeducation. It is incredible the amount of people who have been excluded from education and who don't have access to information that many of us take for granted. We did a study a number of years ago because there's an increase in people listening to mental health related podcasts. And what we found was people with lower levels of education and lower socioeconomic status, what they were getting from access to psychoeducation was reduced stigma, reduced self-blaming, and increased help-seeking behaviour because they were getting their information on podcasts, which is great as long as the podcasts are good quality. Some of the podcasts that are coming from abroad, for example, are not necessarily good for people in terms of the messages that they deliver.
Beautiful, thank you.
Just say a little bit on that as well. Yeah, that's something in the service we were in that was asked, and that has now actually been changed because of trauma-informed training. To be honest with you, ACEs would no longer; those questions wouldn't be asked at the initial stages, and it really is about that trauma-informed approach from the. It really has to kind of be embedded in the whole service. It's not just, and it's recognising when to ask those questions when it's appropriate, and in the service I'm in, that's no longer, it's not just that service, but in the Southeast, it's no longer asked for that reason. But I think that embedding the trauma-informed and investing in that, because that has to be across the whole organisation, and not just the individual who's working with the person. So, yeah, that's what I'd say.
And Jonathan?
Yeah, I think Jay more or less covered it, but just to go back to Senator Ryan's point, I suppose there is a push-pull because you have, on the one hand, you're trying to build rapport, you're trying to build a relationship with clients, you're trying not to trigger traumas in initial assessments and early assessments, and yet you need to know enough about the client to be able to make a coherent response. So there is always a tension in the therapeutic setting between having enough information to be able to respond effectively and not do harm. And I think Jay's point is well made, that increasingly our addiction services have become far more trauma informed, and those kind of what you might call more intrusive questions that do need to be asked are being asked at a later point in the therapy when clients feel safer and when there's a better therapeutic relationship.
Lovely, thank you so much. And my second question is, in your opinion, at what point is early intervention the most effective? Is it in school? Is it in, I don't know, maternity services? Is it, where is it?
Yeah.
Although I'm here with ACI, I'm the manager of a service, a community drug service, and we have a dedicated child and family centre that's attached to our service. So we will work with people who are at the pregnancy stage, where they've babies from kind of very early months, and we work with them through those preschool years. And I suppose in terms of the service that we're providing, it's an early year service, but it's a wraparound service that considers all these other socioeconomic issues, so poverty, the family, the parents, trauma, a whole range of issues that we know are exposing, maybe that potentially exposing that young child to risk. But it's doing that work in a way that recognises not separating out the mother and the father from the child, but actually working them as a family unit, but really trying to respond to the risk factors that are contributing to where those parents are at and the potential impact of what might be happening in the family. So that's not necessarily drug-specific work that's happening, but there's drug-specific work that's happening with the parents, but it's other holistic kind of early years responses that we're putting in place with those young people. And I think often we we get caught up in what's a drug-specific support, so what's drug education, what's drug prevention. But for me, if we can work with those families at that very early stage and respond to those factors that have contributed to trauma and addiction and mental health issues, then that's the early intervention piece for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ryan. The next person on the list is Deputy O'Murky. You've substituted in for Deputy Devine.
I have Guramaigov Kildare, and look, I suppose we all at times we use the same terminology around here, but that's because sometimes it's correct in the sense, obviously, trauma informed. But I heard just obviously it's the idea of integrated services, which we don't necessarily have. We know that everything almost works in a silo operation, and then we all love talking about early interventions, but it's talking about how necessary it is, not that it always happens. And there's almost, we were dealing earlier in the Children's Committee and for the last while with child poverty, and even in relation to some of the pieces in the Disability Committee that I was sit on. You're literally talking where the Venn diagram happens, and if we could just put the best case scenario and system in to protect and support families and obviously kids that fall into particularly at sometimes dangerous scenarios, we would be a lot better. And it was a couple of weeks earlier here where somebody said straightforward, if we were to just really up our game in relation to the resources we were able to put into addiction across the board and all the rest of it, we could have, and we did, we were, you know, the perfect world, you would actually could bring about a case where you needed a lot less of it into the future. I'm not under any misapprehension that drugs are going anywhere. But when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about the fact that it's absolutely exacerbated by, you know, the issue with drugs and everything else that happens at this point in time. And I suppose the piece that I've seen and I just can't get away from is we need to just have decent screening from a point of view of there's decent engagement with families, then that you can catch these issues, and then that you can actually put the supports in place. But as you will all know, those supports don't exist. And then it's a case beyond that of that, you know, the services we need at a later stage are obviously a hell of a lot more complex. It's almost the same conversation I hear, you know, we're having here, because we can talk about housing, we can talk about poverty, we can talk about all the rest of it. We live in the world that we live in, and I suppose, what does a perfect system look like at this point in time? And that's everything in relation to the early intervention piece, and then beyond that, the addiction services. And obviously, I think everyone would agree from a point of view, it makes absolutely no sense that sometimes people's only choice of getting these services is actually when they get prosecuted and get put through the court system and into jail. And it has to be on a lengthy enough sentence or it won't happen either.
The Lambertus.
So sometimes it feels like it's really big and that we can't fix it. And actually,
very simple.
What's actually happening sometimes is that we could work smarter. So, for example, there are ways of being working in collaboration. In fact, it's one of the principles of trauma-informed practice. I worked in an addiction service before I worked in the university. And in the service that I worked in, we operated an interagency case management system. So every young person who came into us, we identified who the stakeholders were in their lives, and we invited them to a meeting after 6 weeks of working with the young person. So that was if school, justice involvement, if there was social work, probation, etc. And the young person, we would, with the young person, identify what their needs were. And then the people who were responsible for meeting those needs in those different domains were at the table, and they would make a commitment. Where we had, there were Professor Joanna Ivers did a study of this in Trinity, and what she found was that there was missing partners. So there were people who do not turn up to those interagency case management meetings, and that was mainstream education and the mental health services. And the longer you keep a young person in education, the better their life chances. So, you know, if time is wasted and more problems are created if we don't get everybody sitting around the table. So that would be my number one, is that you have interagency case managements with people, not but waiting until they get arrested but as soon as they present looking for help themselves. Because one of the things that you'll find with many of the people who are finding themselves in difficulty with addiction is they have gone looking for help and they haven't gotten it. And then things have escalated. And, you said that poverty is exacerbated by substance dependence. I'd say poverty is relieved by substance dependence. It makes it tolerable. So getting in there much earlier and having all of those agencies sitting around the table would be, and that's easy to do.
Caroline, you wanted to speak?
Yeah, just following on from what Dr. Lambert was saying, having, interagency work is vital, but having multidisciplinary teams within organisations is also really important. It works really well. Clients that access the service are often running across town or expected to run across town to have their needs met, basic needs met, whereas if services had the bulk of what they need under one roof, such as the organisation I work for. We have a multidisciplinary team within my department for addiction, social work, psychotherapy, play therapy, mental health team. And then for the youth service, we have a team that works with young people on the ground who they do after schools projects, summer projects. They work with the schools to help prevent early school leaving. And then we have an education and training department as well that would cater for early school leavers who would do local training initiatives or community employment schemes. So it's a one-stop shop that a person can use or their family can use every aspect of the service. And it works by duty referral, where it's a social work-led duty system, 9 to 5 every day, and a drop-in service. And I think that system works exceptionally well for particular client groups who are marginalised, that have, issues with trust with services. And I think it's something that needs to be adapted or looked at, being adapted as a model of best practice, particularly in this area, because it covers all aspects of biological, psychological and social issues, which is really what we're looking at here today.
It's also just have everything where it's needed.
Absolutely.
It's no different than talking about kids, and we could put the supports that they need in there largely, and you engage families and all the rest of it, and for just you get a far better bang for buck.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Deputy. Sean. Of the Senator Mary Fitzpatrick.
Ciarlach, and apologies for being late. The Senate was sitting, so that's what delayed me. But thank you for your opening statements, and thank you for the work that you do. I always think the Irish, we're kind of. It's a real characteristic of our Irish psyche, this trauma, from the famine, occupation, civil war, economic depression, social repression. And one of you included a stat of 50% of every person had at least one traumatic experience in their childhood, and many more have multiple. And oftentimes, actually, it's become so normalised and accepted. Individuals don't recognise the trauma incidents as trauma. So I'm really heartened to hear your contributions, and Dr. O'Shea, it was very encouraging to hear you recognise and acknowledge, and I do think it is important to recognise and acknowledge the progress that is being made, that has been made and that is being made, and it's being made by people in your professions and in your sector. It's professionals like you taking your skills and expertise to improve our addiction services, to improve counselling, to improve the resources. And Caroline, the model you described there, that is it. It is a holistic model that is required. Humans aren't one-dimensional. We don't have one problem. It's all connected. So it's absolutely essential. And I suppose that's what our committee wants to do, is we want to bring forward recommendations that will support you and your sector to further develop, to meet the needs adequately. So I'd like actually to ask each of you to talk about prevention for a moment, and to give me you know, if you had a blue skies, you know, opportunity to put priorities in terms of prevention actions, because one of you mentioned, I think, a public health awareness. I apologise now, it was when I came in, we're talking about a public health campaign around trauma. But what would that look like? Is that a public health campaign around resilience, around wellness, around respect and dignity and empathy? But I really would like your views on prevention, because already we all recognise there's an inadequate percentage of the health budget, the 27, almost 30 billion euros that will be spent this year on health for mental health and addiction. So we obviously want to correct that. But I think a big part of it also has to be a very significant increase in funding for prevention, an investment in people's health, an investment in people's wellness. So if you can talk to that, if each of you could give me your views on it, I would appreciate it. And Dr. O'Shea, if maybe you'd like to go first, and then we'll, yeah.
Thanks, Senator Fitzpatrick. And like you're absolutely right. In many ways, we're like the fire service, and we think we provide a pretty good fire service, but nonetheless, there's a fire lighting by the time we get there. And I do believe that trauma is, you know, runs through the lives of individuals, families, and whole generations like a fire. And I think your question is about how do we stop that fire from getting started. Yeah. And I think there are definitely simple things we can do. I remember many years ago asking a public health nurse, you know, how do you stop this cycle? And she said, at the time, she said, well, when I do the first baby visit, she said, I can see the risks. But I think one of our colleagues said, you know, if we're working with young men and young women before they have kids, I think we're you know, so really working with people from the very start of their lives. So intensive supports, particularly for vulnerable families. And I think we need to provide supports for all families, but we need to target vulnerable families. I think we also need intensive resources and supports in our community. Intensive youth programmes, education programmes, employment programmes. When young people are engaged in positive activities, when young people are engaged in education, when young people are engaged in employment, they're far less likely to be engaged in problematic drug use, and they're far less likely to be engaged in the whole range of behaviours that go with that. So I think what we need to do is we need to obviously be aware of the risk factors, and we need to try and minimise the risk factors. But we need to invest heavily in protective factors. And protective factors are in families, they're particularly in vulnerable families, they're in communities, but they're particularly in vulnerable communities.
Thank you. Gormageth. Laura?
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what Jim has said there. I think it's that investment in protective factors. And I think when we're using the language all the time and we focus on addiction, I think it's really important to think about, well, what's fueling and what's driving the addiction? And it is all these issues that we're talking about, and I think that's where the prevention needs to start. I think there's another conversation around kind of drug prevention, and we often think about, you know, a drug prevention programme being delivered in a school setting or maybe in an hour school setting. And I think for me it's important that that drug prevention piece is considered in a broader health promotion aspect and a broader health and well-being. So it's not just information about drugs and alcohol and the potential risks, but it's a broader health promoting approach to understanding drugs and alcohol and choices around drugs and alcohol. But also we know where children have access to those other protective factors like sport and other curricular activities, which are also often costly, that again, if we invest in communities to have those available to young people, then that's a good start.
Jay?
Yeah, I'd probably just echo what's been said, but I think it is, and I think you said it yourself, it's a holistic approach, and not seeing addiction as, I think someone else said it, it's often seen as that's the issue. It's not the issue, that's the symptom, almost the symptom or the solution. And so looking at what are the factors that contribute to it and investing in those, and that holistic approach, that interagency approach, I think that's where that's what needs to be looked at to address those factors. Yeah.
Cormac. Sharon.
Yeah. And in relation to the interagency piece, and you know, I've already said that there was missing partners there. So one of the things is that the mental health services sometimes are in there kind of re-examining that medical model of mental health. there's lots of committees that happen in different departments where it's fundamentally a mental health issue, and there are often not psychologists or psychotherapists on those committees, and that there is somebody representing a medical aspect, which is great, but there has to be a psychological understanding of factors and social understanding of factors. And in terms of prevention, it's the first 3 years. So we do know what those risk factors, we do know there are people who are disproportionately impacted, people who are parenting alone, people who have a disability in the household. And when we, like, the data is really clear, actually. So when you look at the data from the Health Research Board, there are 2 groups of people who use drugs in equal amounts. And that's people with lots of money and people with no money. And they are using exactly the same amount, but one of those groups is experiencing significant harm as a result of their use. And that is simply and purely because of economic status. So it's just really clear that we have to reduce social inequality, because when we do, people are happier and healthier. And as everybody said, you know, you participate more. We really have to understand why young people are not participating in education. So there's lots of discrimination and racism against people because of their ethnicity, because of their sexuality. There are children who don't go to school because school is a very, very unhappy place. So the protective factors need to be improved and the risk factors need to be reduced, and we know, and we've known for a very long time what those are.
Can we allow Caroline?
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to echo what everybody has said here today. I guess intergenerational trauma and addiction, it doesn't discriminate, but I suppose for the purpose of this, we do know that it's far worse, for want of a better word, affects marginalised communities a lot more. Where do we start? With what we have today is, you know, in terms of prevention, we need more facilities, like safer home environments for children. Homelessness is such a huge crisis at the moment, and it's growing and it's contributing to this issue. We need more secure homes for children, mother and baby facilities for mothers who are coming out of treatment, or, you know, mothers who are in treatment with their children or pregnant and having a safer road to recovery for them and their child. Education, psychoeducation, stigma, reducing the stigma around reaching out for supports and making supports more accessible, more family support services, and inclusivity within communities as well. Sports, as Laura said, is such a huge factor in reducing risk, and we could do with more of that in the marginalised communities as well. So the list could go, I could go on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Caroline.
Deputy Graves.
Listen, just to start, thank you all for your contributions today. I found it really useful to have evidence-based presentations, particularly for someone like me coming to this with fresh eyes, you know. So delighted with that. If it works for you, I think I'll just go briefly through each of your presentations and ask you just one question each, just to focus things. So I'll start with you, Sharon. Clearly your work has kind of put the trauma and intergeneration trauma very much on the map for policy makers, and particularly the piece on the Cork-Simon, which highlights the link between the adverse childhood experience, homelessness, and substance abuse. And I think it's interesting to note that the figures kind of don't match with the general figures initially. I've spent the last kind of 10 months meeting and visiting community-based addiction services, and the biggest eye-opener for me was the level of trauma that people are enduring. And, you know, and it also appears that the issue is not that people are addicted to a particular substance, but the actual childhood trauma that they went through, you know, and that's the biggest problem. So really, my question to you is whether you would agree that to tackle the causes and the long-term intergenerational trauma will take kind of complete structural system changes, which will only come about when the government makes this a political priority, which they don't currently do. And that's, you know, taken into consideration the factors that you've already outlined in terms of education and things. And look, I'll move on then, and if you all want to come back then at the end, it's probably better to give you more talking time. So, Caroline, then, you know, the words of the woman that you referred to really kind of hit home. I met a group of women recently, and they spoke to me about survival sex, and that was a matter of basically, you know, having sex with somebody to have somewhere to sleep at night time, you know what I mean? Because they felt safer by doing that, going into hospitals and things like that. I met with Ishka here on Tuesday, and you know, it was heartbreaking to listen to the stories of the people there, but it was also very inspirational to see how they had worked through it and where they moved on. So my question to you would be, how do you think, because I think this is a huge, huge problem, I actually raised it in the Dáil yesterday evening, we have a vast problem with homelessness, but it affects those in addiction way more than others, in that if they're in hostile environments, they tend to be with other people that are going to break their recovery because they can't get away from it, you know. So how do you think we could deliver emergency housing that's trauma-informed and that actually helps people rather than re-traumatising them, you know, where they have a safe environment and they feel secure, but they also have access to services that they would need that maybe others may not need. And then finally, James, so just do the rounds. I was particularly impressed with the emphasis on the dual diagnosis, which is a massive problem, because we all know that people that are in addiction have been sent, you need drug services, no, you need mental health services, and never the twain should meet. And that's a huge problem, because people don't fit into a box. So, you know, your analysis that reducing intergenerational trauma requires strong policy direction, 100% agree with that. So my question would be do we need somebody central at a departmental level that would coordinate this and ensure that we really have a comprehensive health-led approach to drug use? And if not, what else would you suggest? So,
witnesses. Sharon, if you...
I started with Sharon, so...
Yes, so you were talking about the prison, and that particular client group that I work with would echo what you probably heard from that group of women, and it's a serious crisis for women on the streets in particular. The hostels are not safe, they're mixed gender, and if somebody is leaving prison, if they've had a period of time in there where they've become detoxed or somewhat stable or accessed some form of treatment or support, they may be ready to access something else. But when you're leaving the prison system back out into that hostile system, forget it, is the bottom line. There's no hope. I'm currently running piloting cocaine and crack health-led approach programs with the South Inner City in the Doka Centre, and what's emerged from those groups is that they're terrified at the prospect of leaving, and it's literally when you're walking out the door or preparing to leave, they really don't know what's ahead of them, and it's bleak, and they can go left or they can go right. If they have a support worker, they're lucky enough to have a support worker from, say, Tusnua or somewhere like that, to meet them at the gate, to bring them to their service to get their first payment, which is not really realistic across the board. If they're lucky enough to have that, that's some kind of hope. But again, it's just really difficult to avoid. There needs to be a reinforcement of services within those services. Tusnua, for example, they have a drug-free house, and you know, we need more of that. We need more safer housing for women and men leaving prison who are ready to access treatment as a halfway home, I suppose, for people to move on and reduce the rate of recidivism in the system. It's so costly. I think we really need to divert money elsewhere into systems that will work and will have longer term health effects, and as somebody said, more bang for our buck. And you know, it's only fair to people. It reduces the levels of trauma when women are out in the street. I know I'm sorry, gone over time, but the sexual violence that happens and the I suppose trading for drugs as well, it's a sad reality, and it's happening in broad daylight, and it's not that anybody wants to do it, but it is happening.
Yeah.
So I think we need to really examine this.
Thank you, Deputy Graves. Senator Nicola.
Sorry, I asked questions of each of the
did you?
three. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll be allowed to ask them, so if anyone else wants to come in. Sorry. Sorry, Deputy Graves.
So I think your question was to me about how could government prioritise it. So by having a health-led approach to drug use, and I know that there's been a lot of talk about that. There's, you know, been various committees over the year, including the Citizens' Assembly. We still don't actually have a health-led approach. It is still a criminal justice approach. You know, and Caroline has said there about the amount of money that's spent on that. If that money was actually diverted into health, addiction is a mental health issue, but it is still hanging around the edges of justice very much so. So that would be my thing, would be moving addiction into mental health and implementing not a health-led light approach now that would satisfy people who have a moral objection, but to have an actual evidence-based health-led approach.
Senator, yeah, go on, James.
1 minute. Just, I think in terms of leadership and in terms of, you know, pushing initiatives forward, I would probably argue that specifically for trauma, because we have emerging dual diagnosis services and they will develop, but specifically for trauma, because that's what takes a lot of my attention and my thinking, is if we had a centralised led initiative to increase and improve trauma treatment within addiction services, both within the HSE and within the voluntary and community sector. Addiction is very difficult to treat, and our outcomes, no matter the best of our addiction services, our outcomes are going to be poor and we are going to have relapse. Trauma is imminently treatable. Like, we see people every day whose lives are absolutely destroyed, who the lives of their families are destroyed by trauma. PTSD can be treated and cured. And if we focus our energy on training addiction service staff in the voluntary and the public services to be able to effectively treat trauma, that's the best bang for your buck.
Thank you, Deputy Graves. Senator Nicola.
Okay, thanks very much. Sorry I was late, but I was actually listening to you in my earpod, so I got your opening statements. Thanks very much. I might just pick up on what you were saying there, Dr. O'Shea, about PTSD and other traumas that are treatable. And I saw in your opening statement, and I heard you talk about CBT, which can be, I think, I spoke to Tom Conlon about this recently. You might know Tom Conlon, he's a psychotherapist in Cork. It can be used effectively to treat dual diagnosis. You know, people suffering from both the mental health aspect and the addiction. Can you give us a bit of an insight into how that works? Because I don't hear enough about it, frankly.
So I suppose in terms of the work we do, the interventions that have the best evidence are cognitive therapy for PTSD. It used to be called trauma-focused CBT, and also EMDR, which is a trauma reprocessing therapy. They're the ones that are most recommended in the international guidelines. So if we want to be on the button with evidence for treating trauma effectively and efficiently, we're looking at either CBT or EMDR. They're the ones that get the very best outcomes. They're also the ones that are, I suppose, easily located within the family of structures for treating addiction services, because addiction treatment generally works in quite a structured way. Addiction services are generally structured, and these interventions are quite structured as well, so they fit hand in glove into the services that we have. But I treat trauma for a living, and I suppose I treated addiction for a living for most of my career. It's far easier to treat trauma. It's far easier to get good outcomes. Now, we still have to treat the addiction alongside it. But imagine the level of distress we can take out of people's lives, and imagine the level of distress we can take out of families' lives by treating their trauma symptoms. And I suppose we've talked we've talked about the different levels of trauma intervention and, trauma-focused and trauma-aware care. But from an addiction work point of view, probably the two most significant interventions are trauma stabilisation programmes, which really teach clients self-regulation, self-management and coping skills to be able to manage their symptoms and to be able to manage their trauma symptoms so they're able to function in the world despite the fact that they have traumatic life experiences. And secondly, if we want to treat the trauma, as in cure the trauma, we need to be using trauma-focused approaches which reprocess the traumatic memories. And I suppose that's the ultimate goal, that's the gold standard you want to be going for. There's no reason why anybody should have to live with traumatic life experiences if we can offer the appropriate evidence-based interventions, and I think that's where we need to put our money.
So how challenging is it then when, you make a great case for the trauma and the ability to recover from trauma and for trauma to be treated.
Yeah.
And I know it's evidence-based, but how much more challenging is it then when you've got a case of dual diagnosis whereby the individual is obviously self-medicating, and that's where the addiction begins in the first place. So when they're, I suppose, gone beyond initial treatment, how difficult is it for you as a medical professional to treat the dual diagnosis?
It is difficult. I mean, probably people with complex trauma and people with current active addiction are going to be the people who will struggle the most in terms of any psychological intervention, and equally with trauma intervention. But there's a lot of evidence, particularly over the last 10 years, that would suggest that good addiction treatment stabilises trauma. And I think in this country we have good addiction treatment right across the public service, right across the voluntary and community service. We've increasingly very good, very evidence-based addiction treatments. So we probably don't need to invest a lot in the trauma stabilisation programmes. We need to invest in good addiction treatment programmes. And when people are then able to engage with trauma-focused, specific trauma treatment approaches, they can. But the evidence is really that we don't need, historically what we've done is we've tried to stabilise the addiction before we treat the trauma. But obviously the traumatic symptoms cause people to relapse. But I did a search of all the international evidence on this last year, and it's clear that the gold standard is to treat them together. And addiction workers and mental health workers with appropriate training are well able to hold the complexity of that kind of intervention.
I suppose the question then is how widespread is that service, and how easy is it? It's very difficult to get access to a dual diagnosis treatment plan. Am I right? Or
well, our dual diagnosis services are only emerging. So, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think there are specific dual diagnosis programs that are emerging, but I think, from a practice point of view, from a community-based service provision point of view, often the challenge that we have is something that on paper seems very simple, which is we don't have that kind of concurrent treatment approach. And unfortunately, what happens for the person, they're getting bounced back and forth between two different services. Or as an addiction service, you're spending a lot of the time, rather than doing the addiction work, trying to route or signpost the person to the mental health service. So I think it's come up a few times this morning around that more kind of joined up, shared kind of working, that we just acknowledge that these issues are presenting at the same time, and how do we just work with those issues at the same time, and what would make that easier for people themselves and for us as service providers. Because we know how to do the work that we're meant to be doing, but sometimes it's those blocks that create the difficulties for us. There's another, we've 7 services, community-based services around the country that are resourced to deliver a seek and safety programme, which is very much set up to work with people who are presenting with trauma-related challenges, addiction and other mental health issues, and also issues like domestic violence. That's only in 7 sites across the country, and 5 of those sites are in Dublin. If that was even services like that, if they were to maybe be resourced that little bit more, that we could see an expansion of those services. But that is a service that very much kind of says, yeah, come in, and we acknowledge that what has you here is a whole range of different issues that are presented.
I suppose the point you make there about the 7 centres and 5 of them being in Dublin, like this isn't an urban problem. This is a problem, you know, that's reoccurring everywhere. Just my last question: there was a conversation around public health and public health nurses. I did speak to a public health nurse recently who's dealing with a lot of these challenges just on an ad hoc basis, and there is no service in this particular town. But she was saying that, you know, she would like to see more clinical nurse specialists in dual diagnosis based in public health clinics. Is that something that, you know, you're the experts in the room, is that something that would work? Is that something that would be easily rolled out if the initiative and the funding was there?
Dr. Lambert?
I suppose something that worries me when we talk about dual diagnosis specific services is that we are othering a particular group of individuals. And if we're going to argue that addiction is a mental health issue, why are we saying that there's one mental health system for one group and that there's this other group? Because the reality is for example, if I have problematic relationship with food, that could be a behavioural addiction. I'm not excluded from any services because it's food, but because we've positioned drugs as a criminal issue, we have othered a group of people who have a chronic health issue. And so I've kind of moved. 10 years ago, I would have been sitting here saying, where are dual diagnosis services? But I suppose one of the things about being trauma sensitive is you're supposed to be open to change and learning. And I suppose more recently, my reflection has been, why are they not able to use the same services? If I had depression or anxiety in the morning, why would I be excluded from a service if I was also using drugs and alcohol?
Yeah, there's no reason for it, I suppose, because we've got, you know, gamblers as well that are dealing with all sorts of trauma. It's definitely something to be explored, I think. Okay,
thank you, Senator McQuillan. We'll come back around for a second round shortly. Deputy Brabazon, would you like to?
Yeah, just one quick question of the witnesses. First of all, thanks very much for your presentations. I missed a good chunk of it, so I apologise if I'm repeating the question at this stage. There's earlier on there was a kind of an intimation that if we intervene sooner and deal with intergenerational trauma, that we can save a lot of money for the state. Is there any particular studies done on that, or does anybody have any empirical evidence to offer in respect to that? Because I think it's very significant. Not only are you helping the individuals, but you're also helping the taxpayer, I suppose.
Any of the witnesses like to come in?
I had in my opening statement, so a study done in 2018 in the United States said that PTSD was costing about 232 billion. A more recent study from the UK, which was 2022, said that per individual, that the burden of cost to the state in the UK would be 14,780. But they argued that's a very conservative estimate, because it doesn't include all of the other challenges that come around a person. So trauma is costly for the individual in terms of emotional pain. It's costly for the family, but it's also financially costly. And sometimes we're coming too far on that journey and spending money on justice-related responses, which sometimes keeps people on the same path rather than deterring them from it, because it's not a health response. So taking some of that money, people in the Department of Justice won't like me, but taking some of that money and shifting it over to the Department of Health might be one way to start.
Thanks very much.
And I should say Dr. Lambert has also given us a very helpful big bibliography over. That'll be online as well if you want to have a look. Any more questions? No? Thank you, Deputy Brabazon. I think it's around to my turn now. Firstly, thank you so much for your contributions. It's been incredibly informative. I have just a couple of questions, just scribbling as you're talking. One of the contributors talked about drug prevention programs, or a question was asked about drug prevention programs. There will be a module coming up shortly for this committee in relation to education modules and drug prevention modules. Will obviously take. What advice would you give to the committee as we approach education modules from your own kind of expertise in terms of, because I'm very conscious of walking into school, and sometimes you walk into certain places, you can feel trauma bouncing off the walls almost. But walking in and kind of almost offering a just say no or drugs are bad, what advice would you give this committee as we endeavour on that particular module? And that's open to anybody. Yeah, Dr. Lambert.
Sorry for coming in there again. I actually have strong views on this, and they're not my views, they're based on research. There is no such thing as a neutral intervention. So every time you do something with children, it has an impact. And what some of the studies have found is that actually drug prevention education actually harms vulnerable young people, because you may be introducing information to them that they did not have yet. It may be coming, but they did not have it yet. So we also know that the say no to drugs thing, which has been around since the 50s or something, has not worked. It's clearly not working. So harm reduction, so seeing drug prevention in the context of mental health. So talking about all that goes with that and not just drugs on its own, because again, you're stigmatising people who use drugs and you're placing them as somehow separate than if I was talking about being kind on social media. All of those things impact on your mental health. So it should be integrated into well-being that currently exists rather than targeting people. And we also know, for example, with programmes in the past that went out and targeted young people who were deemed at risk but had not yet committed an offence or participated in that behaviour. We now know that those programmes actually increase risk, because what you're doing is you're saying to the community, this young person is a problem. They haven't presented the problem yet, but that's what we think of them. So they become stigmatised within that, and it actually increases their risk.
Yeah. I think. Jay, I'm conscious. Did you have your hand up, Solder?
Yeah.
Go on, I've spoken.
I'll probably say what just one thing to say. From working with people, what I'd love to see is actually, we talk about coping skills. So drugs education, actually, I think it would have nothing to do with substances or drugs. It would have to do with how to cope, how to manage emotions, how to do all the stuff that we do when we're working with people. I'm teaching people how to do psychoeducation around that, and if that could be introduced as part of education, or people learn that at an earlier stage, I think that would be really helpful for prevention, even if we're talking about trauma or anything like that. So,
true.
Yeah.
And I think helping young people around decision-making skills, and it is that broader health promoting framework that it often doesn't even need a conversation around drugs or alcohol, but it's health and well-being, but also just trying to recognise the context within children, their context which actually influences the decisions that they're making. I think that's important from an education and prevention point of view.
Carla?
I think there's a gap with parents as well, in terms of their own education around their own substance misuse, maybe. There can be normalisation of cannabis or alcohol at home that might be sending conflicting messages with whatever drugs prevention education the children are doing. So I think maybe there's a broader piece that might need to be done with adults as well, just to complement that piece of work.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to clarify one of the things I said in relation to drugs education is that it is important to do the drugs education around harm reduction, but what happens is it happens quite late when it is introduced. So when I'm saying about not doing it, I'm talking about in primary school, that you're talking about well-being in a broad setting, and then when at the age that we do know that young people start to use drugs in early adolescence, and drug taking is part of risk-taking behaviour sometimes, that you do the harm reduction piece, and that is also important.
Thank you, Chair.
Could I just one quick comment on that?
Yeah, James, I'm just conscious of 2 minutes.
No,
I do
okay,
want to, I promise, whatever you're going to say, you'll have the opportunity to say, Shirley, I promise. I want to ask about prisons as well. And I know we're not this session again, it's not about prisons specifically, but it is going to factor into a lot of the work that we do. I mean, we've hugely high rates of recidivism in this country. I think it's close to 7 out of 10 people who go into our prison system will return within 3 years. A friend of mine often says if you had a hospital that had the same figures of return, you'd be asking questions. What are we getting so wrong in terms of how we do prisons? somebody I don't know if we're doing rehabilitation, I don't know if we're doing simple punishment, but it seems like whatever we're doing, we're just getting it wrong. What would you say to somebody who held that belief? Yeah, Caroline.
I think we've a massive missed opportunity within the prison system. I've heard a high-ranking officer within one prison referring to it as warehousing people. That's not rehabilitation, and unfortunately, from their point of view, that probably is what they have to do, is ensure the safety of everybody in the building. But we have missed an opportunity here where we have so many willing professionals who are going into prisons to provide therapy, but it's, you know, on an ad hoc basis, or, you know, at the will of the Section 39 organisation that's doing inreach into the prison systems. But the prison services could provide core rehabilitation programmes for people in there who want to access rehabilitation, even if it's preparation for release into treatment. But we need to have more of a statutory focus on that.
Okay. Any of our witnesses like to talk a little bit about how we're doing prisons, what we're misunderstanding, where the opportunity is that we're not seeing? Effectively, what I'm asking is, people go into prisons, a lot of people are going to go in there, they may have an addiction that's dealing with a trauma that's being passed down. And when they come out of the prison, it seems that everything is being compounded and made worse. How would we make it better?
I think it's the question first about, is the prison the place where somebody needs to be for help and support? And I don't know the statistics, but I mean, we know that a significant number of people who are in our prisons are there because of not even drug related, but there because of their drug use, yes. Right? And that's the trauma, and that's all these other issues that we've spoke about. So is the prison the place to help and support somebody to overcome those issues? Or is there other places where people can be directed when it's known that there's an offence that is related to that addiction?
Is the prison the place?
I think so. Could I just say one other thing? I'm not disagreeing with that, and that's it, and whether it's the right place or not, but I think one thing that it's what are people coming out to? I think that's a big thing as well, because sometimes people, for not saying it's the right place, but they may actually do okay in prison if they're in there for a while, they stabilise or whatever, and then what are they actually coming out to, and what supports are there? Not just what environment are they coming out, but very often there's no supports, from what I can see, that, you know, it's once you're out of prison, that's it. There's no continuation there.
Okay. I don't want to take advantage of the clock. I'll let everybody else do, but I've had to, for the chair, unfortunately, I can't. We've gone around the second rounds now, actually. I think we've gone through, if that's okay. So we're going to go to the second rounds. Members will have 4 minutes during the session to ask questions. Yeah, Deputy Burke, you're first.
Thank you very much for your contribution this morning, and, you know, for the work you're doing. I suppose one of the things that occurred to me when I was Minister for a brief period of time dealing with this whole area, I visited quite a number of the centres that were providing support. But one of the things that occurred to me, for instance, I think I've visited a total of, you know, I've visited them right around the country in Cork, Wicklow, Dublin, Limerick. But one of the things that occurred to me was, while every one of the organisations that were providing help and support were doing an excellent job, one of the things that occurred was the lack of coordination. And I'm just wondering, from your own point of view and from your own experience, could a lot more be done in relation to coordinating a whole range of areas, both from the point of view of prevention, from the point of view of treatment, from the point of view of access of services, that everyone is doing a very good job, all of the independent groups, but is there sufficient coordination and sufficient organisation there to make sure that you could deliver a far more comprehensive service? I'm just wondering from your own experience.
Yeah, I suppose the map for that is our National Drug Rehabilitation Framework. It provides a really, really comprehensive framework for care planning, for case management, for interagency working. And I think probably, Deputy Burke, the ultimate, I suppose, way of getting really good coordination is to push very strongly for implementation of the National Drug Rehabilitation Framework.
Okay. But I'm just wondering, did people find that that people were providing service and very good service, but that in certain areas then there were gaps in a particular region where the service wasn't being provided? And that could there be a lot more coordination done in that whole area?
You mean between services
Yes.
that are providing the same type of service?
Between services, between the health service, the educational facilities, right across the board, there doesn't appear to be that level of coordination.
And I think that the National Rehabilitation Framework does provide a really good model of doing that, but services can opt in and opt out. I think as well, when you create a situation where you have organisations that are doing amazing work, but they are worried at the end of the year, are we going to get the money next year? So you can create kind of pockets of people who are all feel like they're all competing
But
for
that
the
then
same
would fit
pot.
in with a kind of a 3-year plan for every one of those organisations.
I would say 10-year.
Oh, I know, but
Yeah.
but initially you mightn't be able to give a commitment for 10 years because governments change and ministers change. But I think something like a 3-year plan as a start, I think you'd accept would be helpful.
Because community organisations are a vital part of a community. Statutory organisations are obviously very important, but it's really good to have both. And it feels like in the last few years that the community sector is becoming more and more stretched and pushed and concerned about funding, the higher rates of turnover. Caroline spoke earlier, I think, about the need to protect the welfare and the well-being of staff as well. It's hard as a staff member if you are on how do you go and apply for a mortgage if you're in a contract where it's just renewed every single year. So I think a bit of more strategic long-term investment in community-based organisations that make them feel more solid and secure. They can retain their excellent staff that they have. And that people.
But a lot of these organisations have sprung up because there are a gap in the backup services for people. Therefore, the question is, once they're in place, the question is then about making sure they get the support, but also that there is coordination in the service that they provide and work with other groups as well, because every one of them I found seem to have been working very independently in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Unfortunately, keep moving on for this session. Your time's up.
Okay, all right.
So I'm going to have to be strict on this one because everybody wants to get a second round, I can see. So, Senator Ryan.
Thanks, Ciara. Dr. Lambert, you mentioned that only 1% is spent on addiction and 5.8% is spent on mental health. And I think that's really telling. And I think until addiction reaches the same level of spend as mental health, it's going to be increasingly hard, as great at the work that everybody's doing, to get to that level where dual diagnosis even is a combined kind of thing. Why do you think that spend is so low? Is it because the government's not taking addiction seriously as a health issue, or is it that it's just been shoved to justice?
A significant amount of money is spent on justice-related response to addiction, and I think we have, by moving it into the mental health space and by reducing the stigma, there are people here who will remember the 80s in Ireland when we did not talk about mental health at all. It just didn't. Nobody had depression or anxiety. In fact, when people died by suicide, often that was not written down that that's how they had died because there was such stigma and shame. We've come an awful long way from those days, and that was as a result of fundamentally seeing a shift in how we think about mental health. So a public health campaign that reduces the stigma and shame associated with addiction, which is also supported by the required amount of money that's involved in addressing it, because the relapse rates have been mentioned because there's such a queue of people trying to get into addiction services. And they're desperate, they're really desperate, and people are trying to get them through. So I know when I worked in a service before, we looked at it, for every €4 we were spending on treatment, we were only spending €1 on aftercare. And that's when people are at highest risk of relapse. Yes. And when you're highest risk of death as well, unfortunately, if you relapse and you go back to using those substances. So there's a huge amount of money invested in road traffic to try and reduce road traffic related death. So So I just think reframing it as a public health issue, because it still feels very much like it is a criminal justice issue.
Anything to add? No. No, that's great. Yeah, that was my only question.
Thanks a million, Senator Ryan. Next is, in terms, it's Senator Fitzpatrick, you're next.
Yeah, Gurmagath Kirloch, and I have two questions. First, Sharon, you mentioned there when you were talking about prevention and education and young people and actually introducing drugs education and how it can be counterproductive. But you also then mentioned, and I think I heard, and I'd just like you to clarify because I want to be sure that I'm getting you correctly, the youth diversion services, and actually referring a young person to a youth diversion can be counterproductive. Can you elaborate? Did I hear you correctly first? And can you elaborate?
Yeah, so it's the way in which it's done. So when you go out and you decide that an individual from an area or a community or a family is at risk of committing crime, and then you take them and you bring them into a group, but that young person has not been in trouble or anything like that. So it's kind of a targeted. We have to be really careful about what message we're sending to that young person. I have worked in a Garda Youth Diversion project, and I know that when we went on activities, people would refer to us as the Garda kids.
Okay. So my understanding of how the referral process works is that a young person has to have come to the attention of the Gardaí for them to be referred into, not youth services, but a youth diversion programme. Yes. So, like, it's not that, the Gardaí or, I don't know, any other authority figure goes knocking on the door and says, young person, go into the youth diversion. It's that the young person has come to the attention. And my experience of the youth diversion programmes is that most of them do work in a more proactive and constructive way. They do outreach, they're engaging with young people, and in a preventative way, working to engage young people before they will come to the formal attention of the Gardaí or the authorities.
It has certainly moved, from the time I was in it, but it's not a great idea to bring young people to an activity centre, for example, if in a Garda bus. When other children down the road are going to that activity centre and they're not being dropped off there in a Garda bus, it interferes in the way in which the world interacts with those young people. And it increases the stigma attached to those young people. So that has shifted and changed 100%. And my understanding is that it's when the person is at the point of potentially a caution now that's when the intervention is happening. But there have been times in the past where people have gone out to particular children based on their surname or the street that they lived in. And it's fine, we have to provide services for all young people on that street so that you're not saying that this one young person in particular is somehow special, because that can create...
I suppose the reason I questioned it is I'm a director of a youth service and a justice youth diversion programme, and I would be horrified, to think that any youth service would operate like that in this day and age or in recent times. So I thank you for that. Can I just ask you something else? It's around the new regulations that are being brought forward by Corú, for the regulation of counsellors and psychotherapists. And I'd like your views on those new regulations being brought forward. Are you happy with them? Do you think they'll be a positive for counsellors and psychotherapists? Or what are your comments? Dr. O'Shea, I see you indicating.
For addiction counsellors of Ireland, I think we have to be cautious how we respond, because our board is currently reviewing those regulations and will formulate a position on them. I can give you a personal opinion if that's of any consequence, and just so I'm clear, it's my own personal opinion and not the position of ACI, and that is I welcome the regulation. I think it will bring counselling and psychotherapy on a par with the other regulated professions. When you regulate professions, you improve quality, you improve standards, you improve continuing professional development. I think we obviously will have views on particular aspects of the Coro regulations, and we'll write to Coro in due course about that. But so I can only comment personally, say I certainly welcome them, and I think it's a hugely positive step forward for the professions of counselling and psychotherapy. And probably in the next month we'll formulate an official position and we'll communicate it to Coro.
That'd be great. Has anybody else any other comments? Or? Okay, Gurmag.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you, Senator. Deputy O'Mork, you were...
Gurmag. I think Dr. Lambert was talking about the Scared Straight program, wasn't that? That was the idea. And in America, it got talked up for years, and it was the idea of taking kids in, you know what I mean, and they would take them into prison, and you can imagine what the interaction would have been. And what they found out is when they checked the percentages, they said, oh, we have a huge amount of these people, of these kids that don't end up engaging. But then what would happen is there was a whole pile of kids that were probably never going to. Then the other kids who went in would hear dreadful things, and they, you know, from these guys would feel emasculated, and it ended up, what happened is they had to go out, they went out and felt a compunction to commit crime, to big themselves up again. So it didn't work in any way, shape or form. Now, I would probably say, you know what I mean, a number of youth diversion projects. And I know what you're saying about the Garda bus, and I understand that around the stigma. The only thing is sometimes that's a decent enough interaction with the Gardaí, which can be very positive in relation to both the Gardaí and the kids as regards a relationship. It's something positive. And I understand there's a best practice way of doing it. But, you know, the greater level of interaction, actually a big issue is not having the Gardaí engaging enough in those type of projects. Also, look, we said early intervention. They're now talking about youth diversion program's going to work to do it a lot earlier. All of this stuff isn't done at an early enough stage. Look, you've dealt with the majority of what I wanted to talk about. Could I ask a question about just EMDR and those very specifics? I was completely taken away when I said it before, so if you just hear, I'll let you talk rather than me, whether or not.
EMDR, it's a trauma-focused therapy. So it's based on directly treating trauma memories, so essentially when we have traumatic life experiences, our memories of those traumatic life experiences are stored in a different way to how normal memories would be stored, and they're often stored in what you might describe as a slightly more chaotic way. So when those memories are remembered, they're remembered sort of through flashbacks and nightmares and a lot of very disturbing, distressing stuff. So what EMDR and other trauma-focused therapies in different ways do is they reprocess those memories so that they're located within our normal memory networks and within our normal resources. And like I said earlier, you know, in terms of evidence,
as opposed to re-traumatizing, which can happen in some cases, yeah.
Yeah, but this EMDR would be a very, very efficient, effective, evidence-based method. Absolutely, yeah. So really, what you're doing is you're storing the memories in a more functional, healthy manner. They might not be good memories, but they're not traumatic memories.
No, well here. I remember getting explained to me, so I just wanted to put on the record by yourself rather than me.
Highly effective.
Yeah, no, that's it, and we need to see more of that. I suppose that just the last question I would deal with is it's almost back to it's the integrated service when you spoke about it. A number of you spoke earlier, and it is the fact that even when you have some of the parts, mental health and other services, because of the deficiency in service, aren't necessarily there. So therefore, you know, anyone who's operating in the system is doing this with baling twine, you know, and I suppose if anyone just wants to talk to those difficulties to a greater level and from a point of view of what we can do to rectify it, other than the obvious of resource all of it and get everyone talking to each other.
Yeah, I think it's a resourcing issue, but it's also an issue around how we view these issues that people present with. And we need to change the mindset from not viewing that these are issues that stand alone and needing to address them on their own, but actually there are issues that are occurring together, and how do we support somebody? So that is that is to do with resourcing, but it's also to do with just changing our mindset that we don't always need to change or to fix one issue before we can fix something else.
We set up silos in Ireland, and that's the problem. And you're either dealt with this service or you're not, but it throws you out of another service. Where
But if you're not dealt this
exactly.
service, then actually you might remain to be trying to have all your needs met in a particular service that isn't set up to address all those needs. And in community services, we often tend to fill all the gaps because we don't want to have waiting lists and we don't want to send people away feeling or being unsupported.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
The flexibility.
Deputy Graves.
You have to be very flexible. Just a question. It probably feeds into what Rory had said. Caroline, you mentioned earlier about like a one-stop shop type of service for people, but we are all in separate silos. And I'm just kind of wondering how you think that would work, particularly in rural areas where there are no services. So trying to combine various different services when a lot of people are actually travelling to Dublin because there isn't anything, there's no community-based service, even some of the bigger towns and cities around the country. So I'm just wondering, have you any idea how that could be rolled out in rural areas?
Yeah, I guess the service I work for follows that model, but we have an outreach service. So, I mean, if you were to look at more of a satellite type service, that would provide an outreach service delivery to people's homes or in their nearest community centre or wherever the client would like to meet. That, you know, that works quite well because our clients would be spread all over Dublin and some outside of Dublin as well, and we would meet our clients where they're at, and that's always worked very well. I don't like more maybe remote services. It's not always ideal. During COVID, yes, it was all we could do at the time, but just more accessibility to people. But yeah, rural, I say outreach, and I don't know. Like you can't set up a service in every local town or that, but having more flexibility and availability of services.
Just over the years, a lot of the services, set up kind of originally as community-based service and grew, but that was fine when the vast majority of the drug problems were concentrated in the large cities, north and south inner city, etc. But every village, every town, as we know, in right across the country is affected now. But the services aren't there, and there are a lot of people kind of moving to if they're seeking services. And then they arrive in Dublin, there's nowhere for them to live. They're on the street, the usual, and it escalates and escalates, But the satellite outreach centre, I suppose, is a start and grow from there. No, thanks for that. That's it.
Thank you, Deputy Graves. I suppose at this point we've probably finished all the questions from the members. I'd like to please.
No, the answer to hand, but it's by way of a follow-up just to Deputy Brabazon's question. This idea of the cost, and the cost roughly of incarcerating somebody is about 100,000 a year, let's say, ballpark figure. And then, Caroline, the service you describe, this all-round holistic service, and I don't expect you to have this off the top of your head, but I think it would be useful for the committee if you could help us with maybe we could use your service just as a model, because this is done in all of your admin that you have to send back to qualify for the funding and that, to give us a sense of what the cost per client is, let's say. As I say, not off the top of your head, but it would be helpful, I think, if we could get that, because I think you're right. I think we all agree having all the services clustered, or primarily clustered in the capital and other big urban centres. We know why it happened, but there's needs throughout the country, and outreach can work, and but to try and cost that, because I think we need, as a committee, to make a strong argument. If we want to have a health-led approach, a truly health-led approach, then it is going to require redeployment and reallocation of resources. And to do that, it would be helpful for us as a committee to be able to kind of quantify it, even in ballpark figures. So maybe if I followed up with you on that, might be.
Just to add to that, though, we're a non-profit organisation, obviously, so our funding is for staffing. So it probably wouldn't be too difficult to get those figures for you, so I can speak to my colleagues about that.
Thank you. Thank you. That'd be great. And thank you all.
Thank you all. At this point, if there's anything that hasn't been asked or something else a point you'd like to build on, or somewhere where I might have interrupted, feel free to take the time. Yeah, Dr. O'Shea.
Prevention, if I could, Chairman.
Please have a little go for it.
Because as I was listening to my colleagues, starting with Sharon, if you play back the tape, they wrote a really good model for drug prevention, and I think they highlighted the concerns as well. I spent 5 years of my life when I was much younger working in one of the old health boards as a drug education prevention officer for the health board at the time, Eastern Health Board, and I think Sharon's initial point should be a baseline consideration is that at best most drug prevention programs don't work, and at worst they can do damage, and probably every single penny the government or the HSE or anybody else spends in supporting families and supporting communities, that's money you're spending on drug prevention, because you're building resilience in communities, you're building resilience in families. And then the other piece that Jay and others mentioned, coping skills, resilience building skills, etc. They're the skills we need to be teaching people, because if people have good coping skills, if they have good resilience, they don't need to self-medicate, they don't need to take drugs, or if they do, they know how to manage themselves out of it. And finally, and I'd love to get my hands on that committee when it comes to, you've got to keep people like us out of schools, because the people who are best placed to do drug education, drug awareness, health and social skills are teachers, youth workers, parents and peers. And to go back to Sharon's point, when you're wheeling in the guy from the HSE or when you're wheeling in the guy from AA or whatever else, for the most part, a lot of the research and evidence suggests that actually increases levels of experimentation rather than decreases them. So people are already working with young people. If they're resourced to do these drug prevention initiatives, we're far better off. Sharon?
Yeah, because I think that sometimes drug prevention is confused with drug education. And the reality is that people do use drugs, and people have always used drugs and will continue to use drugs. So you're right, going in and saying, drug prevention and why you shouldn't, it hasn't worked. And in terms of, I think it was the World Health Organization in the UN recently, a couple of years ago, said about a fundamental shift that we need to have in how we think about mental health is, and I spoke about this already, is that medical model which kind of views the individual as the problem. But every time we go to sit around and talk about humans and human behaviour, it's asking ourselves who's in the room and who isn't. So there are too many times when decisions around health behaviour are discussed, and there is not a psychological, psychotherapy or social part to that discussion. And I think that there needs to be a class analysis of what we do and the way that we do it, because just again going back to the statistics that we do have with the HRB, is that there are some people in our country who are able to use drugs and experience not too much harm, and then there are others who end up with their lives absolutely ruined because of social inequality and access to services. And I think that the Garda one is a good example. There's lots of amazing youth workers, Garda youth diversion workers, JLOs. And have we given those youth projects enough money so that they don't have to rely on a Garda van, for example? There are other young people in the country who are also going to youth projects. Their parents would not think it would be acceptable for their children to arrive anywhere and pull up outside a play centre, a play activity centre, arriving in a Garda van. So are those projects getting enough money so that they can deliver what looks like on the outside equality? I have had the fun of arriving at an activity centre with a group of young people from a Garda Youth Diversion project, where it was clearly a Garda van, and the minute we stepped off the bus, it was a hostile reception. And the young people didn't appreciate the reception, and then we were leaving within 10 minutes. And I know that if I brought that same group of young people, in a different van, that wouldn't have happened. And I do know that there are parents who wouldn't have thought it was acceptable. And I think that that's because we don't always do a class analysis. Are all of our young people getting access to the same thing in the same way? Or are we doing it differently based on their ethnicity and their class, which makes them always stand out then and then they don't always get the full benefit of what it is that we wanted to deliver to them, which is what the youth workers, the graduate diversion workers and the JLOs want. So, sorry, that was a very long, roundabout
Thank you, Dr. Lambert.
thing.
Jay, Laura, Caroline, if there's anything else you'd like to say before we cut you off, feel free. But if there's not, no.
Just in terms of resources, I think, you know, there's lots of good stuff happening, and I think resourcing can include training the people that are there as well. It's not always about additional things, which would help as well, but training as well. There was some, not to speak too much about it, but there was, like, I was involved in something where there was some investment, and I've done the EMDR, so we can now incorporate it into our service, and we are doing that at the moment. So that's an example of resourcing as well, not, you know, so just seeing it from that perspective. What is working out there to kind of replicate it as well, because there's lots of good stuff working.
Thank you. Okay. Well, with that in mind, then we'll bring the meeting to those. I want to say thank you so much for bringing your expertise into the room. We hope and we will see that reflected in the document that we're developing as a committee for in the coming months. So thank you so much for your time. And that brings our meeting to a close. I have something to say. The meeting is adjourned until Thursday, the 6th of November, when we'll hold our session in public at 12:30 p.m. 6th of November, that's what it will be.
Oh, there we go. Get myself back on camera. Just turn. Boom, there we go. That's better. Yeah, as you just heard there as well, the next session is going to be the 6th of November. So what's that, like 2 weeks away? 3 weeks away, actually. So the next session is going to be the 6th of November. What are the reasons there for that? What's the significance of the 23rd to 30th of October? Why can't it be held then? God damn it. It's just frustrating, I suppose, if I was to have it my way, if we were to have it our way, I suppose we would see these meetings being held day after day. Like, it shouldn't be a case of how long it's taken. These people who are sitting there, these TDs, they're senators, they're paid to do their work. Surely they should be able to sit there for a day, hash this out, look over it, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks at most, maybe, to kind of hash through it all. Like, why aren't they doing it? Why are they appointed to a committee and not really putting any time and effort into it, and running out, stepping into other committees, having to do meetings or votes there or whatever the case may be? As a couple of them were stepping in and out of meetings, you can understand people have commitments or whatever, but to be fair, the topic at hand is quite an important one. Surely a bit of dedication to be able to put that time aside. When I think about it, me as a campaigner, the amount of time I put aside, I was able to sit down and put myself in front of a camera. But what you don't see behind that was the time and effort put in to kind of gather the stories, put a bit of a show together, I suppose. Interview guests, all of that stuff. I wasn't getting paid for that. I wasn't making an income. That wasn't my job. That was just me as a campaigner. But why don't these people up there, policymakers, have the same dedication to the job that they are doing? They're actually getting paid to do what they're doing. They should be representing voters. They should be listening to people. I took the time, the effort to go down to meet with Colin Burke, try to educate the guy, but all he really wanted to do was just spout his own statistics, his own, what would you say, propaganda towards me that look, yeah, prohibition is working, we're open to harm reduction. He talked about the Citizens' Assembly, but the whole time he was just not listening to what I had to say, which was frustrating. I'm just going to bang up my mic there, so there we go. I think that's a bit better. Was probably a little bit low there. Sorry if you have to turn it down now. But yeah, as I say, I met with Colin Burke that time, and like, the guy's back in there. He's sitting up there, a member of this committee, and not once, like, the guy has me in his inbox. He met me. I sat in his office for about 20 minutes or so chatting with him. He could have still reached out and say, "Hey Martin, I'm part of this committee, such and such is coming up. What's your opinion on this or that?" Not that I'm some sort of expert, but I am somebody in his constituency who went to the effort to meet out with him, chat with him on that particular topic of drugs. But no, but again, maybe that's a bit big-headed of me. Yeah, so these things, this is just not happening fast enough. Cass asking there as well, be interested to know how many informants are currently deployed on the streets of Dublin to entrap poor communities. Yeah, informants, is that rats? Like, do you know, people who are maybe after being caught with a 50 bag and they're now going to snitch on somebody who might be getting a delivery of quantity of, let's say, cannabis. Because that happens. I'll never forget, years ago, a young fella, being brought to a guard station, separated from my cousin, being brought to another room and been strip searched, told, get off my clothes, down to my jocks. Intimidating enough. Is what was I, 17, 18 at the time. Yeah, been kind of asked while in my jocks, look, we know where you got this, because I'd get caught with a bit of cannabis, a bit of hash. I would have been 18 because I was back from Amsterdam, because what I actually had with me was 2 little baggies, 2 separate strains of a bit of cannabis from Amsterdam, and then 1 other baggie with a bit of hash in it. I was gutted to lose it, brought it all the way back from Amsterdam and lost it, and I had no problem. I said to the guards, I brought that back from Amsterdam. They're like, no, we know where you got it, and they were mentioning who I got it off. And it would have been my Uncle Willie, may he rest in peace. He's passed away now, and so is my cousin actually, who that happened with as well, rest in peace as. But they were kind of put me in position saying, we know you got it off your uncle, we know you got it off of Willie, and I was like, no, I didn't. I brought that back from Amsterdam, and they were like, look, just tell us somebody who has drugs, we know your uncle has it, tell us about him, whatever. It's like, no, not a hope. I was like, I'm not going to be doing that. And I was saying to him, I was like, what if I give you somebody who's selling heroin out there? They were like, yeah, can you get us somebody who's selling heroin? And I was as if like I'm going to put myself in that position, but kept them on the long finger. They were ringing me there every couple of weeks. Do you got any information? Why haven't we heard from you? Eventually just went ahead and went to court and that. But geez, when you think about it, back then, and informants and people, rats as they would be called, they get put in an incredibly dangerous position, because if they get figured out, there's no court case worth avoiding. If you get figured out, consequences of that are going to be much more greater than what the court could impose on you. Court's not going to break our legs. Spliff says we need to be treated fair in line. As that in lines, if we live across the border, we can be legal. Yeah, that's true. I was actually with one of the guys yesterday, and he was talking about doing a protest. Shout out to Joe and shout out to Ali. But yeah, we're talking about doing a protest up in, I can't remember exactly the name of the town, but there's a town which is linking the Republic to the north, and the walk between the two is actually like just a hop, skip and a jump. And they were talking about doing a protest on one side over to the other side, get some patients in the north and march them to the other side, show that, look, hey, they're criminals, or they're not criminals on that side. And I don't think they are either on the other side, to be fair. I think their prescription is like respected to some degree over here. But then also get patients here then to march back with them. Patients who would be criminals here and potentially seen as patients on the other side if they had the relevant boxes ticked, as in they're a resident in the north, have a, what's that, NHS number, is it? Maybe registered with a doctor up there. But yeah, just to prove that point that, look, hey, come here, there's a magic line there, and patients can easily access cannabis from one side, and the other side they're treated like absolute criminals, and the barriers together are so high, nobody actually gets it. Well, some people do, but to be fair, I've been kind of asking for it. I've got medicine-resistant epilepsy, and still no luck. They put me on this drug there now that seems to be, touching wood, keeping the seizures under control, but it seems to be kind of interfering with my ability to articulate myself and to be able to speak in things. I've been not doing too bad here, but definitely felt like I've been getting kind of stuck once or twice. Yeah, Neil Woods, he was a great speaker, actually, an interesting guy to meet there years ago. Former UK police officer and undercover drugs operative. He told me they made him consume heroin and live homeless for 5 years. Yeah, he was a very interesting guy, had an incredible story to tell. And Casa here pointing out also the man will never be the same again, living now with PTSD. It's just not worth it, the war on drugs. It's just victims all over the place. When you think about the law enforcement, the danger that they've put themselves in needlessly, especially over there in the US. Not to say that it's not dangerous here, but when you kind of look at the cartel violence that goes on over there in the US, maybe I've got a kind of a what would you say, an overinflated view of it because of some of the cool movies you watch and that. But yeah, needless to say, there's definitely plenty of real life evidence out there of the violence that goes on over there. And here too was there. There was definitely some crimes related here to drugs and drug gangs and all of that crack. Don't know any off the top of my head except the one where your man was misidentified in Limerick. Forgive me for not being able to remember his name, but that one will always stick in my mind. Casa says here, ask Northern Ireland how the last 50 years of paramilitary control of the drugs market is going. Great, I'd say. Cormac says, well, it would be dangerous here if they actually tackle dealers rather than young lads stoners. Yeah, well, that's the thing. If they were actually tackling the dealers, it's just going to be, like, they're never going to get them all. There's always going to be more people to step in, and the people who might step in mightn't be the best people to do it, and it could end up in more violence, more problems, you know, increase the risks. It's going to increase the prices, possibly. I remember that during the droughts, and they try to charge you a bit more. I haven't really heard of a drought in a long time. I know there was a buddy on to me there kind of saying he couldn't get it through a regular source because of a recent seizure that happened. Apparently the seizure was it was closely related to the guy he gets his off, so apparently the guy he gets his off gets it off the guy who got raided. Or gets it off a guy who gets it off the guy who got raided. It's like, it's crazy, the drugs market. But yeah, droughts, he was able to get onto somebody else and had it just within like 5 minutes of finding out the other guy couldn't get it from. So the war on drugs is just not going to work. But yeah, it was an interesting and it was an informative committee session. The generational trauma, the conversation that was had there, it was good. It was informative, but it lacked the. Sorry. Yeah, it lacked the acknowledgement that the prohibition of drugs is just not helping the situation. There was a couple of the speakers there were kind of egging on the idea that the prison system is the way in which they can get access to people, get them in behind bars and all of that. Like, but no, it's not. You're not going to be able to help a person there. The best place to be able to help a person is when they present themselves for help, and the best way to present themselves for help is when they're not seen as stigmatized by society as an addict, as a junkie, as any other derogatory term that's used there. To describe a person who uses a drug that isn't regulated in society. It's referred to as an illicit substance, an illicit drug, because we don't view people who consume cigarettes as a drug user, as junkies, as addicts, nor alcohol or any of that. But yeah, that was a big. Yeah, it left a big absence there within that meeting, which is unfortunate. Thank God for Sharon Lambert being present in the meeting and kind of talking some sense at times. It's just unfortunate that there was nobody there able to actually engage with her, and the likes of Colin Burke, the likes of the other TDs that were there weren't like digging in deeper to that. So it was ridiculous. Who was saying there as well that was it Sharon was warned not to talk about it? So I don't know, just looking back through the comments. Yeah, no, not seeing it there, but somebody was kind of pointing out that was she told not to talking about the fact that the prohibition isn't working, criminalisation people isn't working. The mass production of synthetics filled the drought gap pretty swiftly, I'd say. Yeah, I've been kind of even seeing more about synthetics coming out there, even from the US now, from states where prohibition still exists. It's not legal everywhere, but products kind of being tested by, again, campaigners. People want to draw attention to this. They're buying them off the shelf, having them tested, and finding them having a cocktail. That's the word, a cocktail of all these different synthetics, and not being good at all. Numerous people ended up in emergency rooms presenting because of just, I would just say, mass delusion, psychotic behaviour. But not good at all. We still see them here. I don't know anybody know what the latest synthetic that's going around. I don't know, I hear THCPX or something like that was one. The other folks from ACL, not Sharon. Yes, I see what you're saying. The people behind her. As Sharon was independently speaking there herself, which was great. Thank God she isn't actually, like, there'll be nobody to be able to kind of put reins on her and rein her in. To be fair, she just so yeah, you were right. The report from Europol back in 2020 said 90+% of cannabis flowers seized are synthetic. That was 2020. Jeez, that's a while back. I wonder how that's changed. It's unfortunate they don't do thorough analysis of what they actually seize here. Was it what was that report again that was released by the FSI? Was it an annual report that they put out about the drugs and the results that they were getting? But it showed that, Jesus, was it 3/4 of the gummies, the edibles that they tested were synthetics? I believe there was a lot anyway. But again, how much of that's influenced by seizures of these gummies, THCs, synthetic cannabinoids being brought in for the shops and all of that. But yeah. Time do we have? Overtaking on, it's going to be a while yet before we get to 4:20. A few bits to get done there now. Going to get the dinner lined up. But yeah, it'll be good to get back on here, hopefully sooner rather than later. I know that meeting's going to be in 3 weeks' time, but hopefully I can line something up and get on here a bit more frequently before then. I know the guys at the Grassroots Social Club. If you're not already following them over there on Instagram, get over there and give them a follow. I don't know if Rashers is still in the hot box there. Yeah, Rashers is there, all right. If there's any other direction to be sending these people to get them in on the membership so they can be in and know about what's happening with the social club. But at the moment, go over there to Instagram, Grassroots SC. Casa says, yeah, it might have been concentrated in Eastern Europe, like obviously not Spain or the Netherlands. Yeah, that's true. Massive amount of Chinese grows in states using all sort of pesticides and banned substances. Yeah, I wonder how much of that's actually going on here as well. You often hear of grow houses being raided here, and sometimes you're hearing like of Chinese individuals being caught up in it. I've not noticed a large amount of them, but I've certainly noticed a couple along the way, and I wonder how deep they go. Like, are these individuals brought over, trafficked over here into the country? and then put into some of these houses and kind of forced to grow because, you know, do these people have members of their family on hold back in China or what? You just wonder. Wiedebeck says that the legal cannabis scene and the people involved in selling it seem to be trying to sell the most expensive bud and extract the weed. YouTubers do nothing but brag about how expensive their stash costs. Yeah, I hate all of that kind of there's trendy and all of that stuff. I've had my skeptical hippo eyes on for a long time there about the Cali and all of that stuff goes on out there on the black market now. I've been fortunate enough to be linked up with a nice community of growers to be able to kind of lean on growers here in Ireland rather than to be going out there and buying off the black market, which is, again, I'm very lucky. That's what I'd say. But look, if you've got a little bit of space at home, there's nothing stopping you to be able to set up a little tent, a little light, get a little grow going there for yourself. You'd be very surprised at how self-sufficient you can become with a small space, depending on how much you consume. But when you think about what we were mentioning there about the kind of the links that go on within the criminal world when you're buying cannabis, like the guy I mentioned earlier, he was buying from the guy who bought from the guy who bought from the guy who got all his stuff seized and had his house raided. And then the other guy had his house raided. Actually, I forgot to mention that. So the two guys got raided, and then that other guy he bought from was terrified that maybe he was going to get raided. So therefore, it kind of shows maybe that it's safer to grow your own cannabis rather than to buy it. And just make sure that you're just growing a small amount. Don't get carried away like some people out there. Shout out to the friendly grower. Legend. Casa says a pound of cannabis in California costs $300. That's insane. Literally, that's insane. I seen the lady, Elizabeth, geez, what's her name there? I'm going to popped the wrong button. That's the hashtag in the description anyway. Boom, where is she? Elizabeth Locke, there you go. I knew that's exactly what came to my mind. Elizabeth Locke, a Canadian who brought, was it 2 kilos of cannabis or something to Ireland, got nabbed at the border, and she's currently locked up, I believe still. And was 2 kilos, 20 a kilo, 40,000 worth of cannabis. It was possibly more cannabis. 40,000 sounds like a lot less than what she was charged for. But I think she's still locked up. I haven't heard or seen anything about her being freed. Elizabeth. Just going to quickly look at this now. Lock news. Boom. Woman jailed for 2.5 years for importing 500,000 worth of cannabis. Apologies, guys. Apologies. Here we go. No, that didn't want to work. Oh, there we go. That one did want to work. And there we go. That's working. Should have just hit this button, actually. What a dumbass. But there you go. Woman jailed for 2.5 years for importing 500,000 worth of cannabis into the country. So what's 500,000? Is that like 100 kilos? Is it 100 kilos? 30 vacuum packed bags of cannabis. Where does it actually say the amount? Just say the valuation. 2.5 million, 20 for a kilo. A 500,000, sorry, not 2.5 million. It's 2.5 years. 500,000, 20 kilo. Jeez. Anybody good at the maths? Casa asking, how do you test for molds and mildews? The grassroots SC. The thing is about the grassroots, it's about socialising rather than the cannabis. So people bring their own cannabis, if you will. The group doesn't actually supply cannabis. So in that regard, then they actually don't test, unfortunately, for moulds and mildews. It would be great if they were able to actually supply the cannabis and do those tests, or if suppliers were actually able to do those tests prior. But just because of the difficulty, I suppose, in it, the dangers in it, social events seem to be the focus of the grassroots social club. For now. There you go. So about 25 kilos. Is it a kilo? All right. Maybe I was valuing it wrong there earlier. Thanks for the clarification. Was ignorant of the service. That sounds great. No, all good. I can understand the confusion there, given the use of that term in other destinations outside of Ireland. But it would be good. It would be very good. The last event, and hopefully they don't mind saying that that there was people who, like, they were told bring their own cannabis, and then other people kind of brought enough to share with people. These people were kind of just sharing some cannabis they had extra, but they were getting the cost of that cannabis returned to them. And maybe they were given a little extra for bringing it, cover the costs of travel. But you get what I'm saying. Unfortunately, again, the focus of the club isn't the supply, but they do bring it so that people who enjoy consuming cannabis can bring a little extra and share. Yeah, there was one grower actually there, and that grower is in the audience actually, possibly still. And that grower was the only grower actually who was bringing and sharing cannabis that was just grown by that person. So fair play to that person. Hopefully future events might see other growers coming in and being able to share the fruits of their labour. But yeah, it was a great event. Pretty sorry I wasn't more active back then and getting the word out there to people about that event. But this time around, the next time, I certainly will be making more of an effort to get that word out to people. But boom, Casa cultivated 1 kilos dried from an outdoor grow cost me €40 for the Sensei seeds. It was otherwise free for me other than time. Yeah, that's fucking, it's crazy how cheap it can actually be produced. The valuation that it currently sees is because of prohibition. Even in places like where it should be super cheap, it's overvalued because of the exportation of it from there to other places where prohibition still prevails, and that cannabis can be sold as what would you say, commodity? Is that it? Is overvalued anyway. Yeah. Again, pity prohibition wasn't called out more for today in that. Let me close that there. We start wrapping her up there. So guys, again, thanks very much everybody for the comments, for participating in the show today, and watching this Oireachtas committee stream. I don't know how many of you would have actually tuned in over in the Oireachtas TV and taking the time out of the day, so hopefully I'm having the impact of bringing that upon a couple of more eyes, letting people know that the discussion is happening there. And unfortunately the discussion is happening in a way in which they're only focusing on the harms of drug use. It's good that there's witnesses there bringing attention to the fact that, hey, prohibition isn't helping, criminalisation isn't helping here. But the focus of the overall meetings and the committee is essentially on the harms of drug use. So fingers crossed, look, the future meetings will get a bit more productive in regards to addressing the fact that prohibition hasn't worked. Somebody was saying that there's going to be a meeting on cannabis coming up soon, so fingers crossed that happens. I'll reach out to one of the individuals involved in it who might be able to inform me, Senator Nicole Ryan, as to what the topics being covered in the future meetings are. Yeah, exactly. Rasha's describing it a bit more eloquently than me. Saying unfortunately it's not something they can do right now. It's more about providing a safe space to get supply and consume. So that's a lot more eloquent than what I was saying. So a safe place to get supply and consume. We open to any advice on this going forward. And yeah, guys, get over there to Instagram, like the page, follow the page. Verification is a very important thing for the group. They want to make sure, as Rasher's mentioned, their safety, that being a key focus also of the group, safety of the members, providing a safe place. So verification is very important for the verification process. It's simply to know maybe a member who's in the core group, or to be a friend of somebody who's already verified, who can verify for you, you know. So there you go. Hopefully that's enough information for people to go over there and get involved with the social club. Nice of Mr. Wales, great episode. He says, nice to see you back on the air, Martin. Yeah, it's great to be back. Forgive me actually for the little hiccup at the beginning. I was kind of having a bit of a meltdown there, a breakdown, because I came out, switched the computer on, TV, got everything set up, because I have to take it in out of the studio over humidity and bring it back out, click it in and set it up. And I was after thinking, shit, I'm after breaking the desktop here. The graphics card, it wasn't giving a signal out to the HDMI. But after a little bit of tinkering, poking and stuff, I seen actually one of the cables was just a little bit loose. Just needed that little push in to get that lovely click sound when something's fully pushed in. And next to life was regained, and the computer put signal out, and I was back rolling. Might have missed about 10 or 15 minutes potentially there of the start of that meeting, but a lot of the times that's just kind of formal introductions and stuff like that. Yeah, fists up there to Rashers, and may many more clubs be inspired. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. Hopefully doing the grassroots social club will inspire more people in their own local areas to do something a bit smaller. You know, maybe somebody has the space already. I'd love to do something like this locally. So again, putting a shout out to anybody out there who has a space, maybe who they're willing to let out, or they're willing to donate, letting out. But just haven't been able to find a space in around Cork, the city, the kind of just the surrounding areas. Ideal location would be something with access to a bus stop. I think a bus stop is essential really for safety for the members, not having drive there and drive away from there. A bus to there, from there is, I think, the best way to keep people safe coming and going from there. But if anybody has a space like that they're willing to kind of share out, I'm definitely willing to get something set up and get some members in and rolling through. If other people have a space in other localities up and down the country, go for it, like seriously. Don't get carried away, don't get in it for profit, get in it for the social side of it. Look, if you're putting a lot of time and effort into it and there's an ability to take a wage out of it, I think in fairness people should be getting paid for their time and effort in these things. Unfortunately for 20 years we haven't realised that. And I'd gladly do this probably for 20 more, not taking no wage for doing it, because it's the fucking right thing to be doing. Prohibition of drugs is just wrong. So yeah, try your local coffee roasters after hours. They tend to appreciate the quality product. Yeah, that's maybe a downfall of mine. I make my own. I've a routine in the morning to get up, grind my beans, brew the coffee, get a bit of cream and coconut oil in there, blend her up, and then I don't do a coffee for the rest of the day. So if anybody's out there friendly with a local coffee roaster here in the city, who's willing to entertain an after hours private event, that's what we get. Yeah, private event. We get the strong coffee going just to counteract the smells. Seems though that, like, from the social clubs I ventured into over in Spain, the extractor fans that were doing a great job. You couldn't really smell the club, but as soon as the door opened, the smell hit you. The one in Slough didn't. It seemed to have a very good separation between the consumption area and the front door. There was a reception in between, and it seemed like it did it was on point and keeping order under control. only starting up to the point to help inspire people that we can help to put things in place. Yeah, there's some great people behind it, in fairness. Some people a long time campaigning, and it's great to see the campaign, just growing to another level. We're no longer just out there waving our signs and walking down the street and then, going home. Seems like there's a bit more going on here and building, so it's great to see. It is great to see. So for fear of waffling on any longer, guys, because I'm murdered for doing that, time will just get away with, on me. I think I said it like 20 minutes ago. I was going to go in and get dinner going. But yeah, they'll have dinner eating without me if I don't get in there now soon. But yeah, anything else before I go? Anything else I'm thinking of forgetting about? No, guys, just keep an eye out on the channel if you haven't already done so. I'd imagine you already are. Subscribed, following, hitting that bell button, even though they kind of hold back on advertising streams. When they're scheduled and they go live, it seems like sometimes YouTube is a bit slow to give people the notification, outside of maybe the core people who actually do show up. I've tested that in one or two other accounts, and it seems to be the case. But anyhow, make sure you've liked, followed, and all of that stuff over on the other social medias, as I'll get up and I'll post up on those too about going live. Nice one, guys. Peace out. Stay blazed, keep her lit, and catch you again soon. Bye bye.